Welcome. Find yourself a comfortable position, somewhere you can settle in completely. Let the weight of your body sink into whatever surface supports you now. Take a slow breath, and as you release it, allow yourself to travel backward through time with me. Tonight, we're going to explore a world that exists in the popular imagination as a place of serenity and quiet contemplation. When you think of medieval monasteries, perhaps you picture sun-dappled cloisters, the gentle scratch of quill on parchment, the distant sound of plainsong echoing through stone corridors, gardens tended with care, men in simple robes moving peacefully through their days in service to something greater than themselves. This image is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that would surprise you. Behind the high walls of medieval monasteries existed a complex world, one that contained within it the full spectrum of human experience: devotion and corruption, poverty and extraordinary wealth, selfless service and brutal punishment. What we will discover together over the next hours is that monasteries were not separate from medieval society at all. They were medieval society in microcosm, with all its hierarchies, its cruelties, and its contradictions preserved in stone and ritual. We'll begin our journey in the darkest hours of the night, experiencing what daily life actually felt like for those who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Then we'll follow the story of one abbot who twisted his sacred position toward purposes that would scandalize his contemporaries. We'll investigate a mystery that archaeologists are still uncovering, one that reveals perhaps the darkest practice hidden within monastery walls. And finally, we'll discover that not all monks lived the same life at all, that some enjoyed privileges that would make secular nobles envious. But for now, let us step through the gates of a typical Benedictine monastery in, say, the year 1320. The year itself matters little. The rhythm of monastic life remained remarkably unchanged for centuries. Let us walk these cold corridors together and understand what it truly meant to take the vows. It is 2 o'clock in the morning. You have been asleep for perhaps 3 hours, your body curled beneath a single wool blanket on a straw mattress that has grown thin with use. The cell you occupy is barely wider than your outstretched arms, a stone box with a narrow window too high to look through. In summer, this window admits flies and humidity. In winter, it might as well not exist at all. The bell begins to ring, not a gentle chime, but an insistent, clanging summons that reverberates through the stone corridors and drives sleep away like a physical blow. Your feet touch the floor, and the cold of it is remarkable. Stone holds the chill of winter night deep in its substance. The shock of it travels up through your feet, your legs, a reminder that comfort is not the purpose of this life. You have perhaps 15 minutes to dress, to use the latrine, to make your way through the darkness to the chapel for matins. You pull on your habit, the same one you wore yesterday and will wear tomorrow. It is wool, undyed, rough against your skin where your undershirt has worn thin. In winter, this is your only protection against the cold. There are no personal possessions here, no extra layers, no small luxuries. The rule of Saint Benedict is clear on this point. The corridor outside your cell is utterly dark. Candles are expensive, and there is no need for them here. You know these passages by touch and memory. Your fingers trail along the wall as you move forward, feeling the joints between stones, the places where moisture has made the surface slick with moss. Around you in the darkness, you can sense rather than see the other monks, the shuffle of feet, the sound of breathing, but no one speaks. The great silence has begun at Compline, the final service before sleep, and it will not end until after the morning chapter meeting. For 12, sometimes 14 hours each day, you are forbidden to communicate. Not just forbidden from casual conversation, but from any sound at all. You may not hum. You may not clear your throat unnecessarily. You may not greet your brothers with so much as a nod, unless required by your duties. This silence is not presented as punishment, of course. It is framed as spiritual discipline, an emptying of the self to make room for God. But after months, after years of this, the silence becomes a weight of its own. It presses against your thoughts. The things you want to say accumulate inside you with no release. You enter the chapel and find your place in the choir. The building is vast and empty and absolutely frigid. Your breath emerges in clouds. The stone floor beneath your knees will soon become an intimate enemy. You lower yourself into position and the cold strikes upward through the fabric of your habit. Matins lasts perhaps an hour. The psalms are chanted in the darkness, the Latin syllables following patterns worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Psalms 1 through 18 tonight, tomorrow 19 through 36. The cycle continues, unchanging. Your voice joins the others, and perhaps there is something beautiful in this, the human voices rising together in the dark. But your knees are already beginning to ache, and you are so very tired, and when Matins ends, you will not return to sleep. Instead, you will wait in the chapel or return to your cell for private prayer until Lauds, which begins as dawn is just beginning to suggest itself beyond the windows. Then prime at 6 in the morning. Then terce at 9, sext at noon, none at 3 in the afternoon, vespers as evening falls, compline before bed, 8 services, 8 times when everything stops and you must be in the chapel on your knees, chanting the psalms. Your day is not divided into hours, but into these fragments between services. You never have time to sink deeply into any task. The bell is always about to ring again. And between these services, there is work. For some monks, this means intellectual labor, the copying of manuscripts, the study of scripture. But for most, especially in the smaller, poorer houses, it means physical work. The fields must be tended. Animals must be cared for. The brewery requires constant attention, because beer is safer than water, and beer is what you drink with every meal. Bread must be baked. Buildings must be maintained. In a monastery of 50 monks, perhaps 10 work primarily with their minds. The rest work with their hands until their hands betray them. Let us speak of what you eat, because this shapes your day as much as the bells. Breakfast does not exist. You rise at 2, work and pray until noon, and only then do you receive your first meal. In summer, you might receive a second meal in the early evening. In winter, during Lent, during the various fasting periods that seem to occupy half the calendar, you eat once. One meal to sustain you through 18 waking hours. The meal itself is taken in silence in the refectory, while one brother reads aloud from scripture or the lives of saints. You are not meant to think about the food. You are meant to feed your body, as one might feed a donkey, efficiently and without pleasure, while your mind remains fixed on higher things. The food is almost always the same. Pottage, a thick porridge made from whatever grain is available, barley most often, sometimes oats, occasionally wheat if the harvest was good, boiled with water into a paste, sometimes with dried peas or beans added, sometimes with turnips or onions if the garden has produced them. It is served lukewarm. It is grey. It fills your stomach with a heaviness that is not quite satisfaction. Bread, always present, and it is one of the better things you will eat. Dark bread made from mixed grains, chewy and dense. When it is fresh, it is genuinely good. More often, it is several days old, beginning to harden. You learn to soften it in your pottage. Twice a week, perhaps, you receive fish. Not the fish you might imagine, not fresh trout or salmon. Dried fish, salted fish, fish that has traveled long distances and bears the evidence of its journey. Herring most often, small and salty and full of bones. Sometimes eel from the monastery's own ponds, which is better. The fish is meant to vary the diet, but after years of this, the taste of fish becomes synonymous with monotony itself. Meat is forbidden. This is not a temporary prohibition, but an absolute one. The rule is clear. Four-footed animals are not to be consumed except by the sick, and so you do not eat mutton, beef, pork, or venison. Not ever. Not on feast days. Not at Christmas. Your body, deprived of these proteins and fats, changes over time. You become thinner. Your hair becomes brittle. Small wounds heal slowly. Cheese and eggs appear occasionally, and when they do, they are received with a gratitude that surprises you. How can something so simple as an egg become precious? But it does. The memory of its richness sustains you through weeks of pottage and bread. Vegetables depend entirely on the season and the success of the garden. In summer and early autumn, there might be abundance. Cabbages, onions, leeks, beets, peas, beans. In winter and spring, there is almost nothing. Root vegetables from the cellar, increasingly soft and sprouted. The meals become even more monotonous. The drink is small beer, weak enough that you can consume it all day without intoxication. Water from the well when beer is scarce. Wine is reserved for the celebration of Mass, and even then, only the priest partaking in communion actually drinks it. This diet, maintained year after year, has consequences. Your body does not receive what it needs. Scurvy appears in late winter and early spring when the stored vegetables have been exhausted. Your gums become sore and bleed. Teeth loosen. Wounds appear on your skin. Vitamin deficiencies cause your night vision to worsen. Some monks go partially blind by middle age, not from eye disease but from simple malnutrition. The iron from meat is absent, and so anemia creeps in. You are tired always, beyond what the broken sleep can explain. You bruise easily. In winter, you are constantly cold in a way that seems to come from inside your bones. But you are eating regularly, and this is more than many people in the world outside these walls can say. This is the grim arithmetic that makes monastic life bearable. In a village, a peasant family might face true starvation in a bad year. Here, the meals are monotonous and insufficient, but they are reliable. The granary is always kept full against hard times. You will not starve, even as your body slowly depletes itself. The monastery is always cold. Let this fact settle into your understanding, because it is central to the daily experience. Stone walls are thick and strong and permanent, but they hold cold the way they hold silence. In summer, this is almost a blessing. The interior of the chapel and the dormitory remain cool even when the sun beats down on the roof. But summer is brief. Most of the year, you are cold. Your habit is wool, and wool is a marvel of medieval technology. It retains warmth even when damp, and it will become damp frequently from rain, from the humidity of the kitchen, from sweat as you work. But one layer of wool is not enough. In deep winter, one layer of anything is not enough. There is no heating system. Braziers are lit in the scriptorium where the manuscripts are copied, because cold fingers cannot hold a quill steady and ink freezes. A fire might burn in the warming room for a few hours each day, and the monks are permitted to gather there to thaw themselves. But the dormitory, the chapel, the cloisters, the refectory remain unheated. You learn to move carefully in winter because the stone floors become treacherous with ice. The water in the lavatorium where you wash your hands before services develops a skin of ice that must be broken each morning. When you wake for matins in January or February, the shock of cold is so profound that it drives thought away. You are simply a body reacting to discomfort. The chapel services in winter become a special kind of ordeal, kneeling on stone that has been cold for months. The chill creeps up through your knees, your thighs, settles into your hips and lower back. After an hour of this, standing becomes difficult. Your joints have stiffened. The monks around you rise slowly, carefully, and you see in their movements the legacy of decades of this practice. Arthritis is nearly universal among monks past the age of 30. The constant kneeling on stone, the cold, the dampness, all contribute. By middle age, many monks walk with a pronounced stiffness. Their hands, swollen at the knuckles, struggle with fine tasks. The pain is chronic and there is no remedy except perhaps willow bark tea, which helps a little, and prayer, which may help the soul if not the body. Frostbite occurs every winter. Fingers and toes that go numb during the long services and do not warm afterward. Sometimes the damage is minor, a temporary loss of feeling. Sometimes tissue dies and must be allowed to fall away on its own. The monastery does not have a surgeon. You develop strategies for managing the cold. You learn to keep your hands inside your sleeves when not working. You learn to shift your weight constantly during services to keep blood moving. You learn that activity is better than stillness, that as long as you are moving, you can stay warm enough. It is the stillness of prayer, the immobility of services that defeats the body's defenses. And yet you endure this, not just for days or weeks, but for years, for decades, until the cold becomes so much a part of your existence that you barely remember what it feels like to be truly warm. We have mentioned the great silence, but let us understand it more completely. From Compline until after the morning chapter meeting, no speech is permitted except in cases of genuine emergency. But even outside these hours, speech is carefully regulated. Conversation for its own sake is discouraged. You may speak when your work requires it, when asking questions of your superior, when confessing faults. But casual talk, jokes, stories, the simple pleasure of human exchange is seen as a distraction from holy purpose. Over time, this reshapes you. The things you might have said accumulate inside with no outlet. Your interior life becomes vivid and strange. Without the grounding of conversation, of hearing your thoughts reflected back to you by another person, you lose a certain kind of perspective. Your obsessions, your worries, your theological questions circle endlessly in your mind with no resolution. Some monks develop a sign language, an elaborate system of gestures that allows basic communication without breaking the rule of silence. The signs for common objects and actions proliferate, but this is itself a violation, and if discovered, it is punished. The point is not merely to be quiet. The point is to be alone with God, and that requires being alone, even in company. The psychological impact of this varies by temperament. Some monks seem to genuinely thrive in silence. They report that after the initial difficulty, a kind of peace descends. The constant chatter of social life falls away, and something deeper emerges. They grow contemplative, serene. Others are slowly crushed by it. The need for human connection does not disappear simply because it is forbidden. These monks grow melancholy. They withdraw into themselves not peacefully, but desperately. Some develop behaviors that we might recognize as symptoms of mental illness. Compulsive counting, repetitive movements, a fixation on small details that grows into obsession. There is no vocabulary for mental illness in this time and place. What we might identify as depression or anxiety is understood as spiritual weakness, as insufficient faith, as the devil's temptation. And so you suffer alone, unable to name what is happening to you, believing that your struggle is evidence of your own failing. The monastery is presented as a place of refuge, but it is also a place of severe discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict is clear that correction is necessary for the soul's growth, and correction in this context takes forms that we would recognize as punishment and public humiliation. Each week, the community gathers for the chapter of faults. This is a meeting where monks must confess their failings, not privately to a priest, but publicly to the entire assembly. You must accuse yourself of any violation of the rule, any moment of laziness, any word spoken in anger, any thought of pride. But you must also accuse others. If you have witnessed a brother breaking the rule, you are obligated to report it. To remain silent is itself a sin. Imagine the dynamics this creates. Trust becomes difficult when every interaction might be reported. Friendship is complicated when friendship might be seen as particular affection, which is itself discouraged. You learn to be careful, always careful about what you say and do in the presence of others. The punishments vary by the severity of the offense and the temperament of the abbot. For minor infractions, you might be required to prostrate yourself at the entrance to the chapel, lying face down while your brothers step over you as they enter. Or you might eat your meals sitting on the floor rather than at the table, a symbolic reduction to the status of a dog. Public whipping occurs, the guilty monk stripped to the waist and struck with a rod while the community watches. There is also the practice of the discipline, the ritual self-flagellation that some monasteries require regularly. In the privacy of your cell or in a communal gathering, you strike your own back with a whip, offering this pain as penance and purification. The practice leaves scars, crisscrossing patterns of old wounds that mark the monks of certain orders as clearly as their habits. For more serious offenses, the punishments become more severe. Solitary confinement in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, with only bread and water passed through a slot in the door. This might last days or weeks. The isolation, combined with the silence you already endure, can break something essential in a person. Excommunication is the ultimate punishment short of expulsion. You remain physically present in the monastery, but are treated as though you do not exist. No one may speak to you, acknowledge you, or assist you. You eat alone. You pray alone. You continue your work, but receive no instruction or guidance. This social death can last months. Some monks never fully recover from it, even after their formal restoration to the community. And expulsion, when it occurs, is itself a kind of death. To be cast out of the monastery means losing not just your home, but your entire identity. You have no money, no possessions, no trade, except perhaps literacy, which has limited value in the wider world. Your family may not want you back. You are a monk without a monastery, a professed religious living in a secular world, suspected and outcast. Many expelled monks end their lives as beggars or worse. It is important to understand that many monks did not choose this life, not really. The practice of oblation means that families could dedicate a child to the monastery, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old. The child is given to the monastery as an offering, a sacrifice of sorts, and the vows taken on the child's behalf are considered binding. Why would families do this? Sometimes from genuine piety, sometimes because the monastery provides education and security that the family cannot. Sometimes because there are too many children and not enough land to divide. Sometimes the child is sickly or disabled, and the monastery seems the only place they might be cared for. The reasons are many, but the result is the same. A child grows up knowing no other life than this. Imagine it. You are 6 years old, and you are brought to a vast stone building full of silent men. Your parents leave. You are dressed in a miniature habit. You are taught to kneel, to chant, to be quiet. You learn your letters. You learn the Psalms. You forget gradually what it was like to run freely, to speak when you wanted, to be held with affection. By the time you are old enough to understand what has happened, it is too late. You have taken your formal vows. You are a monk. This is your life. There is no appeal, no escape. The law of the church and the law of the land both agree that your vows are permanent. Some oblates adapt. They may even thrive, finding genuine vocation in a life they did not choose. But others never stop feeling the loss of what was taken from them. They perform the rituals with increasing bitterness. They serve their sentence, for that is how they see it, year after year, knowing that freedom will never come. The combination of poor diet, inadequate sleep, constant cold, and physical strain creates a population that is chronically unwell. Certain ailments become so common that they are simply accepted as part of monastic life. Respiratory illnesses sweep through the dormitory every winter. In the close quarters, a cough passes from monk to monk until half the community is afflicted. Some recover. Some develop chronic lung conditions that persist for years, making breathing difficult. Tuberculosis is not uncommon. Digestive problems are constant. The monotonous diet and lack of variety mean that your gut is never quite right. Constipation alternates with looseness. Stomach pains come and go. Some monks develop more serious conditions, ulcers or worse, but there is little to be done about it. Skin conditions flourish in an environment where bathing is infrequent and clothing is never quite clean. Lice are everywhere. Rashes develop from the rough wool against skin. Fungal infections appear and persist. Dental problems are universal. With no understanding of oral hygiene and a diet heavy in grain, teeth decay rapidly. By 30, most monks have lost several teeth. By 40, many have lost most of them. The pain of an infected tooth is extraordinary, and the only remedy is extraction. Performed without any numbing agent, the monk held down while the tooth is pulled with pliers. The monastery does have an infirmary, and sick monks are given some privileges. They might be excused from services. They might receive slightly better food, perhaps a bit of meat broth, perhaps an egg, but the medical knowledge available is limited. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, prayer. Some monks recover because they were not seriously ill to begin with. Some die because there is no treatment for what afflicts them. Perhaps the most difficult aspect of monastic life is its permanence. Your vows are not for a term of years, they are for life. You will die here, in this place, following this routine. There is no retirement, no change of scenery, no hope of a different future. When you're young, this might seem like commitment, like devotion. But as years pass, as decades pass, the weight of forever becomes almost unbearable. The same walls, the same faces growing older alongside yours, the same psalms, chanted so many times that the words lose meaning and become pure sound. You watch older monks decline, their bodies failing piece by piece. You watch them die, often after long illnesses, in the infirmary. You participate in their funeral rites, knowing that this will be your own ending. Not dramatic or heroic, simply worn out, used up by decades of this life. And yet you cannot leave. To break your vows would be a sin of the gravest sort, damning your soul to hell. The monastery is a kind of benevolent prison. Your cell door has no lock, but you are not free. Some monks find peace with this. They speak of having transcended desire, of having achieved a state where the world's pleasures no longer call to them. Perhaps this is true for a few. But for many, the longing for something different never quite disappears. It quiets sometimes. It recedes into the background. But it is always there, a small ache that persists through all the years. And so this is the life, rising in the night, kneeling on stone, eating pottage, working until your hands hurt, silent through the long hours, forbidden to own, to love, to choose, cold and hungry and tired, not for a day or a month, but for all your days. This was not the worst life available in medieval Europe. That is the strange truth of it. For many, this was better than the alternative. At least you ate. At least you were sheltered. At least you learned to read, which set you apart from 90% of the population. At least you had a role, a purpose, a place in the world. But let us not romanticize it. Let us be clear about what it costs to live this way. The body broken down by middle age, the mind strained by isolation and repetition, the soul perhaps refined by suffering, or perhaps merely exhausted by it. As you lie here now, in your own bed, in your own time, let yourself feel the comfort of it, the warmth, the softness, the fact that you can move when you want to move, speak when you want to speak, eat what you want to eat. These small freedoms that we barely notice are immense when set against the life we have just explored. The monks endured. That is worth something. But what they endured was immense, and it is worth acknowledging that as well. Now let your breath slow. Let your muscles relax. The monastery bells are silent for you. You need not rise. You need not kneel. You are free to simply rest. In our next segment, we will discover that not all monks adhered to this harsh discipline. Some, in positions of power, found ways to twist the system to serve themselves rather than God. The story of one such man will reveal just how corrupt the monastery could become, how far the distance was between the ideal and the reality. But for now, rest. Let the images of cold stone and grey pottage fade. You are safe. You are warm. You are free. Let us travel now to England, to the county of Suffolk, to a monastery that stood among the wealthiest and most powerful religious houses in all of Christendom, the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds. Even the name carries weight, dignity, the promise of sanctity. This was no simple country monastery of the sort we have been discussing. This was an establishment that rivaled cathedrals in its grandeur. Its church could hold thousands, its lands stretched across miles of fertile countryside. Its library contained treasures beyond measure, and at the heart of it all, the reason for its wealth and prominence, lay the body of a saint. Edmund had been a king once, king of East Anglia in the 9th century, killed by Viking raiders when he refused to renounce his Christian faith. The story, as it had been passed down and embellished over the centuries, told of terrible tortures, of Edmund tied to a tree and shot with arrows until he resembled a hedgehog, of his eventual beheading. A martyr king, a saint whose intercession was said to be particularly powerful. His remains had been brought to this place, and a church built to house them. That was in the 10th century. By the 15th century, when our story takes place, the shrine of St. Edmund had become one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in England. Only Canterbury, where Thomas Becket lay, drew more pilgrims. And pilgrims meant wealth, extraordinary wealth. They came seeking miracles, seeking healing, seeking forgiveness. They came in their hundreds and thousands, and they brought offerings, gold and silver coins, jewelry, grants of land. Noble families endowed the monastery with properties that generated income year after year. The monastery's coffers overflowed with the accumulated gratitude of centuries of supplicants. This wealth required management. It required an abbot of sophistication and ability. And in the year 1456, the monks elected William Curtis to this position. William Curtis came from minor nobility, the younger son of a family with more pedigree than property. He had entered the monastery at 15, not as an oblate, but as a willing novice. Drawn perhaps by genuine devotion, or perhaps by the prospect of a comfortable life and eventual power, he was intelligent, personable, skilled at navigation of both ecclesiastical and secular politics. His election as abbot at the age of 42 surprised no one. For the first few years of his tenure, Curtis appeared to be exactly what the monastery needed. He managed the estates efficiently. He settled disputes with nearby landowners. He maintained good relations with the bishop and with the crown. He presided over services with appropriate dignity. The monks under his authority had no particular complaints. But Curtis had weaknesses that he had managed to conceal during his rise to power. He enjoyed gambling, particularly dice games, and he was not good at it. He had developed a taste for luxuries, for fine food and wine and clothing that his position theoretically provided, but never quite to the degree he desired. And he had formed an attachment to a woman in the nearby town, a widow of some education and refinement, whose company he found increasingly necessary to his happiness. These are not uncommon failings. Many men of power have succumbed to similar temptations, but Curtis occupied a position that made indulgence difficult. An abbot was supposed to be above such things. His life was meant to be transparent, accountable to his brother monks and to the church hierarchy. How could he finance his gambling? How could he maintain a mistress? How could he acquire the luxuries he craved without arousing suspicion? The answer lay in the crypt. in the elaborate shrine where the body of St. Edmund rested in a gold and jeweled reliquary that pilgrims were permitted to view from a distance, but never to approach too closely. It started small, as these things often do. A French bishop visited the monastery on his way to London, a man of evident wealth and piety. In conversation with Curtis, the bishop mentioned that his own cathedral lacked any relic of significance, and how he wished he could provide his flock with something tangible, some physical connection to the divine. Curtis, listening, saw opportunity. That evening, alone in his private chambers, he considered the possibility. The shrine of St. Edmund was elaborate, crowded with objects. Small bones, fragments, things that could be removed without being immediately missed. And who would check? The shrine was opened only on the highest feast days, and even then the reliquary itself was never examined closely. It was sealed, sacred, untouchable. The theology of relics provided cover as well. It was widely accepted that relics could multiply miraculously. There were, for instance, enough fragments of the true cross scattered across Europe to build several crosses. This was not seen as fraud, but as evidence of divine power. God provided what was needed. If pieces of St. Edmund appeared in multiple locations, well, perhaps that was God's will. Curtis waited several months, testing his nerve, refining his justifications. Then, during a feast day, when the shrine was opened and the reliquary displayed, he contrived to be alone with it briefly. He had the keys. He had the authority. No one questioned his presence. From the reliquary, he removed a small bone, perhaps a finger bone, possibly not even from Edmund's body, but from the collection of anonymous bones that had accumulated in the shrine over centuries. He had this mounted in a smaller reliquary by a trusted goldsmith in London, a man who asked no questions when paid well. And then he arranged another meeting with the French bishop and presented him with what he claimed was an authentic relic of St. Edmund. The bishop, overjoyed, paid handsomely for it, far more than the gold of the reliquary was worth. The premium was for the sanctity, for the miracle-working power contained in that small fragment of bone. The transaction went perfectly. No one discovered the theft. The French bishop departed satisfied, and Curtis found himself in possession of more money than he had seen in years. Money that belonged to no one but himself. Money that could pay gambling debts, buy gifts for his mistress, purchase the small luxuries that made life pleasant. The hardest part, he discovered, was the first time. After that, it became easier. Over the next 3 years, Curtis developed a sophisticated operation. He identified potential buyers through his correspondence with other monasteries, with bishops, with noble families establishing their own private chapels. There was immense demand for relics. Every church wanted one. Every nobleman wanted to demonstrate his piety by acquiring a sacred object. The market was vast and largely unregulated. Curtis could not travel extensively himself without arousing suspicion, so he recruited intermediaries. Several monks who served as the monastery's agents in London and other cities were brought into the scheme. He selected men he had leverage over, monks who had their own secrets to protect or who were ambitious enough to see the personal benefit in cooperation. He swore them to obedience, reminding them that their vow required absolute compliance with the abbot's commands. This was not technically how the vow of obedience was meant to function, but the men he chose were not theologians. These monks carried the relics to buyers, collected payment, and returned a portion to Curtis while keeping some for themselves. It was a conspiracy bound together by mutual guilt and mutual profit. The scale of the operation grew remarkable. Italian merchants purchasing relics to bring back to churches in Venice and Florence, German princes acquiring them for new cathedrals. Even a cardinal in Rome, seeking to enhance his private chapel, purchased what Curtis claimed was a rib of St. Edmund. The arithmetic of the fraud was staggering. Over 3 years, Curtis sold enough pieces of St. Edmund to account for perhaps 3 complete skeletons. Arms and legs and ribs and vertebrae and skulls, all certified as authentic, all accompanied by documents bearing the monastery's seal, testifying to their provenance, and no one questioned it. The multiplication of relics was expected. Buyers wanted to believe. The church had no central authority checking the authenticity of relics. As long as the documentation looked official and the seller was respectable, the transaction proceeded. The money Curtis accumulated allowed him to live in a manner entirely inconsistent with his vows. His private chambers within the monastery complex became increasingly luxurious. Tapestries from Flanders hung on the walls. His bed had silk sheets, a shocking indulgence. Imported spices appeared in his private meals, prepared separately from the refectory's fare. Wine from France, from Italy, from regions that most monks would never visit, filled his cellar. His relationship with the widow in town became increasingly open. He purchased a small manor house for her, explaining to anyone who asked that it was a property investment for the monastery. She lived there in comfort with servants, and Curtis visited regularly, sometimes staying overnight, claiming he was conducting monastery business in the town. 2 children were born to this woman during Curtis's time as abbot. They were acknowledged as her children by her late husband, a fiction that everyone accepted because it was convenient. But the timeline did not quite work, and people whispered. The children bore a certain resemblance to the abbot, but who would accuse him directly? Curtis's gambling continued, now with higher stakes. He could afford to lose, and lose he did, though not always. He hosted games in his chambers, inviting local gentry and merchants, creating obligations and relationships that served the monastery's political interests even as they served his personal pleasures. He entertained visiting dignitaries with banquets that rivaled those of secular lords. Roasted swans, peacocks served in their own plumage, elaborate pastries shaped like castles. Musicians performed, wine flowed freely. Curtis presented himself as a sophisticated worldly abbot, a man who understood that the church's power required the ability to move in elite circles. None of this was technically illegal. Abbots had considerable discretion in how they managed monastery resources, and Curtis was careful to maintain the fiction that all expenses were for the benefit of the monastery, for its reputation and influence. But the monks who lived under his authority, who still ate pottage and slept on thin mattresses, who owned nothing and enjoyed no comforts, grew increasingly aware of the disparity. Resentment built slowly. Whispers in the cloister, meaningful looks exchanged during services, but to challenge an abbot required courage and evidence. And who could provide evidence? The monks who participated in the relic sales were implicated themselves. Those who merely suspected had no proof. The system protected Curtis, as long as he was careful. But Curtis, grown confident after years of success, began to grow careless. The mistake came in 1459. A monastery in the north of England, a Cistercian house dedicated to the Virgin Mary, wished to acquire a major relic to attract pilgrims to their remote location. They approached Curtis through an intermediary, offering a substantial sum for something significant. Curtis, seeing an opportunity for a particularly lucrative sale, offered them what he claimed was the skull of St. Edmund. Not a fragment of the skull, but the complete skull, removed from the body and available for this exclusive purchase. The price was extraordinary. The Cistercians, pooling resources from across their network, agreed to pay it. The skull was delivered with all appropriate documentation. The Cistercians received it with great ceremony, installed it in a new shrine, and began promoting their monastery as the home of this sacred relic. The problem emerged within weeks. The Cistercians, eager to demonstrate their new treasure's authenticity, publicized it widely. They sent notices to other monasteries. They informed the Archbishop of York. They began attracting pilgrims. And word reached another monastery, one that had purchased what they believed was the skull of St. Edmund 30 years earlier, long before Curtis became abbot. That skull had come from Bury St. Edmunds as well, sold during a period of financial difficulty by a previous abbot as a means of raising funds. It was installed in their own shrine, and it had been working miracles quite satisfactorily for 3 decades. Now, suddenly, there were 2 skulls of St. Edmund, both authenticated by the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds. Both claimed to be complete and original. The monastery that held the older skull wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, expressing concern about the potential fraud. The Archbishop, a man of genuine piety but also political sophistication, recognized the scandal this could cause. If one skull was false, both might be questioned. If both were false, what did that say about other relics? The entire economy of pilgrimage, the vast wealth generated by sacred tourism, rested on the assumption that relics were authentic. An investigation was ordered, conducted quietly but thoroughly. Curtis was summoned to explain the discrepancy. He attempted to claim miraculous multiplication, that God had seen fit to provide multiple skulls to meet the devotional needs of the faithful. But the investigators were not fools. They examined the monastery's records, interviewed monks, spoke with the goldsmiths in London who had created the reliquaries. The truth emerged piece by piece. The scale of the fraud became clear. The network of intermediaries was exposed. The monks who had served as couriers, faced with excommunication, confessed and implicated Curtis. Curtis attempted to flee. He packed what valuables he could carry, dressed himself in secular clothing, and headed for the port at Dover, intending to take ship to France. But the Archbishop had anticipated this. He was arrested on the road, brought back in chains, a humiliation beyond words for a man who had held such high office. The trial was held in the monastery's own chapter house, the same room where the chapter of faults occurred each week. But this was no ordinary confession of minor infractions. The assembled monks, bishops, and representatives of the Archbishop listened to testimony for days. The evidence was overwhelming. Ledgers found in Curtis's chambers detailed the sales, the amounts received, the distribution of money. Letters from buyers were discovered, correspondence that made clear the fraudulent nature of the transactions. The goldsmith from London was brought to testify, describing how he had created dozens of reliquaries to house the bones Curtis provided. Other monks testified about the abbot's lifestyle, the visits to the manor house, the elaborate meals, the gambling. Curtis, faced with this mountain of evidence, could not maintain his denials. He confessed, though he attempted to minimize his culpability. He claimed that the relics had multiplied miraculously, and he had merely made them available to those who needed them. He claimed that his lifestyle was appropriate for his station. He claimed that he had acted always in the monastery's best interests. No one believed him, but the church faced a delicate situation. To publicly announce that an abbot had been fraudulently selling relics for years would undermine faith in all relics. If Bury St. Edmunds, one of the most prestigious monasteries in England, could engage in such fraud, what monastery could be trusted? The implications were dangerous. A compromise was reached. Curtis would be found guilty not of fraud, but of simony, the sin of selling sacred things, and of mismanagement of monastery resources. The language was carefully chosen. Simony was a serious charge, but one that did not necessarily impugn the authenticity of the relics themselves. It was possible to commit simony even with genuine relics by selling them rather than giving them freely. The punishment was likewise calibrated to satisfy justice without creating scandal. Curtis was stripped of his position as abbot. He was sent to a remote monastery in the far north of England, a poorhouse where he would live out his days in the same harsh conditions we described in our first segment. Perpetual penance, it was called. He would spend the rest of his life as an ordinary monk, perhaps experiencing finally the life that the men under his authority had endured while he lived in luxury. But even this punishment was not quite what it appeared. The monastery to which Curtis was sent was not as harsh as others. His reputation preceded him, and the monks there, perhaps intimidated by his former status, or perhaps sympathetic to a fallen brother, did not treat him with particular severity. He was given a private cell. He was excused from some of the more demanding labor due to his age. He lived in the end, not in true penance, but in a kind of comfortable exile. He died 8 years later at the age of 53 of natural causes. His death was recorded in the monastery's records without comment. He was buried in the monks' cemetery, his grave unmarked, except for a simple wooden cross. The church had managed to contain the scandal without allowing him to become a martyr. Back at Bury St. Edmunds, the monastery faced the challenge of restoring confidence in its most valuable asset. The shrine of St. Edmund was quietly examined, and the monks announced with great fanfare that they had discovered, in a sealed chamber beneath the altar, the true relics of St. Edmund, untouched and uncorrupted. These, they claimed, had been hidden centuries ago to protect them from Viking raids and had been forgotten until now. It was a transparent fiction, but it was what people wanted to believe. The pilgrims returned, the offerings resumed. Within a few years, the scandal was largely forgotten, buried under the weight of new miracles, new testimonies to St. Edmund's power. But the truth remained. The relics that had been sold were still out there, in churches and chapels across Europe. They still worked miracles, or at least the faithful claimed they did. Prayers offered before these relics were still answered, or seemed to be. The sick still recovered, or at least some of them did. This raised uncomfortable questions that the church preferred not to examine too closely. If fake relics could work miracles, what did that say about the nature of miracles? Did faith itself have power regardless of the authenticity of its focus? Or were all the miracles, even those attributed to genuine relics, merely coincidence and wishful thinking? The church's answer was silence. These questions were dangerous. Better to accept the mystery, to maintain the system, to trust that God worked in ways beyond human understanding. The case of William Curtis was not unique. As historians have examined monastery records and compared accounts of relics across Europe, a pattern emerges. The same saint's body appears in multiple locations, each claiming authenticity. The mathematics become impossible. St. Catherine of Alexandria's bones could fill several skeletons. The fingers of St. Dominic, if gathered from all the churches claiming to possess them, would give him dozens of fingers on each hand. Some of this multiplication may indeed have been pious fraud by believers who convinced themselves that they were handling genuine relics that had miraculously appeared. But much of it was deliberate, calculated fraud by men who saw an opportunity for profit in people's faith. The medieval economy of salvation was built on these physical objects. Relics were currency, they attracted pilgrims, and pilgrims brought money. They secured political alliances, they demonstrated a monastery's or a church's importance. The incentive to acquire them was immense, and the supply of genuine relics was, by definition, limited. So the market created what it needed, and the church, recognizing that the entire system would collapse if examined too critically, chose to maintain the fiction. As long as people believed, as long as the pilgrims came and the money flowed and the political structures held, the actual authenticity of the relics was, in a sense, beside the point. This was the world William Curtis understood and exploited. He was not an anomaly, but a product of the system, a man who saw clearly the gap between what the church claimed to be and what it actually was, and who decided to profit from that gap. As you lie here listening to this story, perhaps you find it shocking, perhaps you find it darkly amusing, Or perhaps you recognize in it something familiar, something that echoes in every age when institutions claim purity while their human administrators pursue very human goals. Curtis was a hypocrite, certainly. He professed vows of poverty while living in luxury, vows of chastity while maintaining a mistress and fathering children. He sold what was sacred for personal gain. These are not small failings. And yet he also managed the monastery effectively. The lands were productive, the buildings were maintained. The monks, even if they resented his lifestyle, ate regularly and had their needs met. He navigated complex politics successfully. In a different context, with different vows, he might have been considered an able administrator. This is the uncomfortable truth about corruption. It is rarely absolute. The corrupt abbot still said Mass. The fraudulent relic still comforted the faithful. The system functioned even as it betrayed its own principles. Let your mind rest on this complexity for a moment, then let it go. We are not here to judge men who lived 6 centuries ago by modern standards. We are here simply to understand what happened, to see the full picture of monastery life, which included not just the harsh discipline we explored in the first segment, but also this kind of opportunistic fraud. The monastery was meant to be separate from the world, but the world always found ways in. Through the gates came ambition, greed, lust, all the familiar human weaknesses dressed in monastic robes. Breathe slowly. Let the images settle. The scandal of Bury St. Edmunds has been quiet now for centuries. The abbey itself was dissolved by Henry VIII less than a century after Curtis' death, its wealth seized by the crown, its buildings left to decay. The relics, genuine or false, were scattered or destroyed. St. Edmund's bones, whoever they really belong to, are long since dust. What remains is the story, a window into how the medieval church actually functioned beneath its sacred surface. And perhaps that story is more interesting than any relic could be. In our next segment, we will explore something darker still. Not fraud, which is at least comprehensible, but a practice that seems almost incomprehensible to modern minds. A punishment so severe, so psychologically devastating, that it amounts to burial alive. But not yet. For now, rest with the image of Curtis in his comfortable exile, having escaped true consequence, living out his days in relative peace despite his crimes. Justice in the medieval church was a complicated thing, shaped as much by politics and pragmatism as by any moral principle. Rest now. The scandal is over, the investigation closed, the monastery continues, everything returns to the rhythm we know, the bells and the prayers and the eternal cycle. Sleep if you can, or simply drift, letting your mind wander through these medieval halls, observing without judgment, understanding without condemning. We'll continue our journey shortly, but for this moment, be at peace. The year is 1845. France has been through revolution and restoration, through Napoleon's empire and its collapse. The country is rebuilding, modernizing, sweeping away remnants of the medieval past to make room for the new age. In a small town in Normandy, workers have been tasked with demolishing the remains of an old Benedictine monastery, abandoned since the revolution dissolved all religious houses half a century earlier. The monastery has stood empty all this time, its church partially collapsed, its cloister overrun with weeds, its buildings slowly returning to the earth from which their stones were quarried. Now even these ruins must go. The stones will be repurposed for other construction. The land will be cleared and sold. The workers are breaking down a thick interior wall in what was once the monastery's crypt, working with picks and hammers, methodically reducing centuries of masonry to rubble. The work is hard and dusty and monotonous. They have been at it for days, and then quite suddenly, one of the picks breaks through into a hollow space. Not a room, not a corridor, but a small cavity within the wall itself, perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet deep. The workers, curious, enlarge the opening, pulling away stones to see what lies within. What they find brings the work to an immediate halt. Sitting in that cavity, in a position that suggests he died sitting upright with his back against the stone, is a skeleton. The bones are brown with age, draped in the rotted remnants of what appears to have been a monk's habit. The skull tilts slightly forward, as though the person fell asleep and never woke. But it is the interior surface of the wall that makes the discovery horrifying. The stones are marked with scratches, dozens of them, gouged into the surface by something hard and desperate. The workers, examining more closely, find fingernails embedded in the mortar between stones, broken off in what must have been frantic attempts to claw through the wall. This person was not placed here after death. He was sealed in alive, and he tried desperately to escape. News of the discovery spreads through archaeological and historical circles. It is not, it turns out, an isolated case. As scholars begin to examine records and other monastery sites, similar discoveries emerge from across Europe. In England in 1850, workers renovating a monastery that had been converted to a private residence discover another cavity in a foundation wall, another skeleton, more scratch marks on the stones. In Germany, during excavations at a Cistercian abbey site, archaeologists find not one but 3 separate wall cavities, each containing human remains. The orientation of the cavities suggests they were deliberately constructed, spaces built into the walls during original construction or added later, designed precisely for this purpose. In Italy, in Spain, in Belgium, similar finds are reported over the following decades. The 19th century, with its enthusiasm for demolishing old religious buildings and studying what remained, uncovers secret after secret that had been literally bricked away. More recently, in the 21st century, ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies have been used to scan still-standing monastery buildings. The results are disturbing. Many monasteries that remain in use show anomalies in their walls, hollow spaces of the right size and in the right locations to potentially contain similar remains. These have not been excavated. The church has not permitted it. But the suspicion remains: how many bodies lie sealed within walls across Europe? How many undiscovered? The estimates range from dozens to hundreds, perhaps more. Each one representing a human being who died in darkness, in isolation, in a space too small to stand or lie down, waiting for death to release them. The practice has a name: immurement, from the Latin in muro, within the wall. It appears in various cultures and contexts throughout history, but in medieval Europe it took on a specific character, particularly within religious communities. The origins, surprisingly, were voluntary. In the early centuries of Christianity, there arose a tradition of extreme asceticism. Men and women seeking to mortify the flesh and commune with God in the most intense way possible would have themselves sealed into cells, usually attached to churches. These were called anchorites or anchoresses, and their choice was considered holy, a living martyrdom. These voluntary recluses had small windows through which food could be passed and through which they could observe Mass. They might live for years, even decades, in their cells, spending their time in prayer and sometimes in writing or needlework. Julian of Norwich, the famous medieval mystic, was an anchoress. Her revelations of divine love were composed in such a cell. But over time, what began as a voluntary spiritual practice became something else. It became a punishment. The line between holy reclusion and imprisoned horror became blurred, then erased entirely. By the High Middle Ages, monasteries had adopted immurement as the ultimate punishment for certain crimes. It was a solution to a legal problem. The church could not execute monks. Canon law forbade religious from shedding blood or taking life. But some crimes seemed to demand more than the ordinary punishments of flogging or solitary confinement. What do you do with a monk who has committed murder, who has renounced his faith? who was engaged in acts that the medieval church considered abominations. You could expel him, but then he was someone else's problem, potentially dangerous, and the scandal might spread. You could imprison him indefinitely, but that required resources, constant guarding, the possibility of escape. Or you could seal him in a wall. Technically, you were not executing him. You were giving him food and water, at least initially. You were providing him with the opportunity for ultimate repentance, alone with his sins and his God. That he would certainly die was merely a consequence of his isolation, not a deliberate killing. This was the logic, twisted but internally consistent within medieval theological framework. The immured monk was legally dead, his funeral rites already performed, but he was alive enough to potentially achieve salvation through his suffering. What crimes warranted this extreme punishment? The monastic records that survive give us some indication, though many cases were certainly not recorded at all. Murder of another monk appears frequently in the close quarters of monastic life. With the psychological pressures we have already discussed, violence sometimes erupted. A fight during work, a sudden rage, a blow that proved fatal. Normally, such a case would be turned over to secular authorities. But if the monastery wished to handle it internally, to avoid scandal or secular interference, immurement was an option. Apostasy was another. If a monk publicly renounced his faith, denied the doctrines of the church, or was discovered to be secretly practicing heresy, the response had to be severe. The Inquisition might be involved in serious cases, but monasteries sometimes preferred to handle their own heretics quietly. Sealed in a wall, the heretic could do no further damage. His ideas would die with him. Sexual transgressions, particularly those that medieval theology considered most serious, could result in immurement. The records are often coded using euphemisms, but the meaning is clear. A monk discovered in what the medieval church termed sodomy might face this punishment. For nuns, pregnancy was a particular category of crisis. A pregnant nun represented a catastrophic failure of the convent's discipline. Sometimes the nun was expelled. Sometimes, in houses that valued secrecy over mercy, she was immured. There are hints in the records of more political uses. A monk who discovered corruption and threatened to expose it. A reformer whose ideas were too radical for his superiors. Someone who had become inconvenient to powerful people. The beauty of immurement, from a cynical perspective, was its finality and its secrecy. The person simply disappeared. No trial record, no public execution, no possibility of appeal or rescue. The process, when it was done formally, rather than as a secret murder, followed a ritual that was designed to emphasize the spiritual dimension while obscuring the brutality. First came the trial, if you can call it that. The accused monk would be brought before the chapter, the community of monks, and the charges would be read. Evidence would be presented, though the standards of evidence were quite different from what we would recognize. Accusations were often sufficient. The presumption of innocence did not apply within the monastery's internal justice system. If the monk was found guilty of a crime serious enough to warrant immurement, the sentence would be pronounced by the abbot. The monk would be told that he was being given the opportunity for ultimate penance, that he would have time alone with God to contemplate his sins and seek forgiveness. The language used tried to frame it as a gift, a chance for redemption, rather than a death sentence. Then came the funeral. Yes, the monk's own funeral, performed while he still lived. He would be required to lie in a coffin, to listen to the prayers for the dead recited over him, to hear himself mourned. This was meant to drive home the point that he was already dead in the eyes of the community, that whatever came next was merely his passage from this life to the next. After the funeral came the procession. The condemned monk would be led, often bound, to the place where the cavity had been prepared. This was usually in the crypt, in the foundations of the church, in some part of the monastery that was rarely visited, but that other monks would pass regularly enough to be reminded of his fate. The cavity itself varied in design. Some were clearly meant to result in quick death, a space barely large enough for the body, sealed completely, no provision for food or water. Death would come within days from dehydration, the body found weeks or months later when the cavity was opened to receive the next victim. Others were more elaborate, designed perhaps for longer imprisonment, a small opening at chest height through which food and water could be passed. Sometimes a cup was provided, sometimes a small vessel for waste. These prisoners might survive weeks or even months, though the psychological toll of such extended immurement was devastating. In a few documented cases, there is evidence of even more extended imprisonment, cavities large enough to sit or even stand in, with regular provisioning. These may have been intended as permanent imprisonment rather than execution, though the line between the two is fine when we are discussing being sealed inside a wall. The actual sealing was performed with ceremony. As the condemned monk watched, masons would begin to lay stones and mortar, building the wall that would entomb him. Sometimes the monk was allowed to speak final words, more often he was gagged or had already been silenced by trauma. The community would gather to watch, to pray, to witness this terrible enforcement of monastic discipline. As the wall grew higher, the light would diminish. In some accounts, the condemned was given a candle, a symbolic gesture. When the candle burned out, he would be in complete darkness. The last stone would be fitted into place. The mortar would be smoothed. And then silence, broken only by whatever sounds the immured monk could make through the small opening, if one existed, or by the sound of scratching on stone, attempts to break free that were always futile. The community would be told to pray for his soul, but they would also be told, implicitly or explicitly, what this fate awaited anyone who transgressed so seriously. The wall became a reminder, a warning, a monument to the absolute power of the institution over the individual. Imagine it. Try, if you can bear to place yourself in that position for just a moment. Not to disturb your peace, but to understand what these people experienced. You are in a space so small that you cannot fully extend your limbs. If the cavity is vertical, you might be able to stand, hunched, your head brushing the top. If it is horizontal, you are perpetually crouched or sitting. There is no position that is comfortable. You shift constantly, seeking relief that never comes. The darkness is absolute, not the darkness of a room at night, which still contains gradations, the memory of light. This is the darkness of being buried, a blackness so complete that you cannot see your own hand before your face. Your eyes remain open or closed, it makes no difference. You exist in a void. The silence is equally profound. The walls are thick stone. Sound from outside barely penetrates. You can hear your own breathing, the beat of your own heart. When you move, the rustle of fabric, the scrape of skin on stone. These small sounds become enormous in their isolation. The air is limited. If the cavity is truly sealed, carbon dioxide accumulates. You begin to feel drowsy, confused. Breathing becomes difficult. You gasp, your body panicking for oxygen. Death from asphyxiation might come within hours if the seal is complete. If there is a small opening for air, you survive longer, but the experience extends. Hunger comes first, a gnawing emptiness that intensifies to pain. If food is provided, it is minimal, perhaps bread and water, pushed through the opening at intervals. You eat in the dark, unable to see what you consume, unable to know if it is all you will receive. Thirst is worse than hunger. The body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. Your mouth becomes dry, your tongue thick. Swallowing becomes painful. If water is provided irregularly or in insufficient amounts, you exist in a state of perpetual desperate thirst. The cold is relentless. Stone draws heat from your body. You have only your habit, perhaps a thin blanket. You curl into yourself, trying to conserve warmth, but the cold penetrates. Your fingers and toes go numb. Shivering becomes constant, exhausting. Waste becomes a problem quickly. If no provision has been made, you soil yourself. The smell becomes overpowering in the confined space. You exist in your own filth, unable to clean yourself, unable to escape the stench. Dignity is impossible. You are reduced to the most basic animal functions in the most degrading circumstances. But worse than all the physical suffering is the psychological dimension. You know you are going to die here. There is no possibility of rescue, no chance of reprieve. You are already dead in the eyes of your community. No one is coming. The only question is how long it will take. Time loses meaning. In the absolute darkness, you cannot distinguish day from night. You try to count, to mark the passage of time, but you lose track. Have you been here for days? Weeks? The disorientation is profound. You think, of course. There is nothing to do but think, and what do you think about? Your crime, whatever it was, whether you were truly guilty or falsely accused, your life, how you came to this point, the choices that led you here. God, if you still believe. Hell, which might be worse than this, but not by much. Or the simple, desperate hope that death will come quickly. Some of the immured left marks beyond the scratches on the walls. In a few cavities, words have been found scratched into the stone, prayers mostly. Lord, have mercy. Forgive me. Sometimes just names, the person's own name repeated as though to remind themselves they still existed. And eventually, death comes, from dehydration, from starvation, from cold, from suffocation, from despair. The body, unable to sustain itself any longer, simply stops. The immured monk slumps into the position in which the workers centuries later will find his bones. The physical remains tell stories that the documents often omit. Forensic analysis of the bones recovered from these wall cavities reveals details about the final days or weeks of these individuals' lives. Many skeletons show evidence of extreme stress. Bone density changes consistent with prolonged malnutrition, fractures that occurred perimortem around the time of death, particularly in the hands and fingers, suggesting violent attempts to break through the walls. Some skulls show damage consistent with the person beating their head against the stone, either in desperation or madness, or to hasten death. The positioning of the bodies is telling. Some are curled tightly, fetal positions that suggest they died slowly, gradually losing consciousness. Others are contorted, limbs extended awkwardly, suggesting more violent deaths, perhaps from asphyxiation or seizures brought on by dehydration. In several cases, forensic examiners have found evidence that the victims consumed their own clothing. Fragments of fabric in the digestive tract, marks on the bones consistent with the person chewing desperately on wool, trying to extract any possible nutrition or even just to have something to put in their mouths. The scratch marks on the walls have been analyzed. They come in layers, suggesting sustained effort over time. The person would scratch at the mortar between stones until their fingernails broke or were torn away, wait for some recovery, then begin again. The depth and pattern of the marks indicate hours or days of effort. None of them came close to breaking through. The walls were too thick, the stone too hard. Carbon dating of the remains places most of them between the 12th and 15th centuries, the height of the medieval period. But some are older, extending back into the 10th century, and a few are more recent, as late as the 16th century, suggesting the practice continued even as the medieval period gave way to the early modern era. For a long time, the Catholic Church maintained that immurement of living monks was largely a myth, a Protestant invention designed to discredit the medieval church. But as historians have examined monastic records more carefully, documentary evidence has emerged that makes this denial impossible. A manuscript from a French monastery, dated 1302, contains a terse entry in the chronicle, "Brother Guillaume was sealed for the crime of sodomy. May God have mercy on his soul." No further details, but the meaning is clear. Records from an Italian convent in 1447 are more explicit. Sister Margherita, having been discovered with child and refusing to name the father, was immured this day in the foundation of the north wall. She was given bread and water for 3 days, after which the opening was sealed. The community prayed for her repentance. Spanish Inquisition records mention the practice in passing, referring to monks delivered to monasteries for immurement as punishment for heresy. The Inquisition itself did not perform the immurement, but handed the condemned over to religious superiors who did. Most damning are the architectural records. Plans for monastery construction from the medieval period sometimes include specific notation for penitential cells built into the structure. These are not normal cells or chambers, but spaces within the walls themselves, clearly designed for this purpose. The builders knew what they were constructing. The practice was not rare or hidden, but sufficiently common that it was planned for in advance. Letters between bishops and abbots sometimes reference the practice obliquely. An abbot might write requesting permission to deal with a problem monk in the traditional manner, or with the severity such crimes warrant. The responses grant permission, but often caution discretion, suggesting that while the church hierarchy approved of immurement, they preferred it not be publicly discussed. How did the medieval church justify this practice? How did men who devoted their lives to following Christ, who preached mercy and forgiveness, reconcile sealing human beings into walls to die slowly? The justification rested on several theological principles. First, the idea that the body was less important than the soul. Physical suffering, particularly when accepted as penance, was seen as beneficial to spiritual health. The immured monk was being given an opportunity to purge his sins through suffering, to achieve a state of grace before death that might otherwise have been impossible. Second, the concept of the monastery as a perfect society, a reflection of the divine order. For that order to be maintained, serious transgressions had to be severely punished. The individual monk was less important than the institution, than the community as a whole. His suffering protected others by deterring similar crimes. Third, the medieval understanding of mercy itself was different from ours. Mercy did not mean avoiding punishment, but rather providing the opportunity for repentance. The immured monk had been given time to confess, to pray, to seek God's forgiveness. That he did so in horrific circumstances was unfortunate, but did not negate the mercy of being allowed to prepare for death rather than being killed immediately. Finally, there was the simple logic of necessity. What else could be done? Within the medieval framework, with its limited options and its theological commitments, immurement seemed like a solution. It removed the problem. It served as a warning. It maintained the fiction that the church did not execute its own members. It was brutal, yes, but the medieval world was brutal in countless ways. This was simply one more. The fact that we find it horrifying says something about how our values have changed. But to the medieval mind, it was a rational, even merciful response to certain situations. Understanding this does not require us to agree with it, but it helps us see these people as they saw themselves, not as monsters, but as faithful servants of an institution they believed was divinely ordained. Despite the archaeological and documentary evidence, much about the practice of immurement remains mysterious. The monasteries did not exactly advertise what they were doing, and many records were destroyed, either during the Reformation or later during various revolutions and secularizations. How common was it really? We know of dozens of confirmed cases, but how many went undocumented? How many wall cavities remain undiscovered? Modern monasteries that still operate have not been extensively examined. The Church has not encouraged investigation. Are there more bodies sealed within walls, in buildings that continue to house religious communities? What was the actual survival time? The documented cases where provisioning is mentioned suggest days to weeks. But were there cases of longer imprisonment? One legend from Germany speaks of a monk who was freed after 20 years when the wall was accidentally broken during renovations. He emerged blind, unable to speak coherently, and died within days. Is this true? Or is it a folk tale that grew from smaller truths? We do not know. Did anyone survive? If the provisioning continued indefinitely, if the cavity was large enough, could a person live months or even years sealed in a wall? The psychological effects would be devastating, but the body might endure. There are no confirmed cases of anyone being deliberately released after immurement, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What happened to the practice? It seems to have largely ended by the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation's criticism of Catholic practices may have made it untenable, or perhaps the practice simply evolved into other forms of imprisonment. Or maybe it continued but became even more secretive. We cannot be certain. When these discoveries first came to light in the 19th century, they caused considerable scandal. Protestant writers used them as ammunition against the Catholic Church. Catholic scholars initially denied them, then minimized them, then eventually acknowledged them while emphasizing that they represented aberrations rather than common practice. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the middle. Immurement was not common enough to be considered routine. Most monks who committed serious crimes faced other punishments. But it was not so rare as to be considered exceptional either. It was a tool in the disciplinary arsenal of medieval monasteries, used when circumstances seemed to warrant it. Modern Catholic scholars tend to contextualize the practice, explaining the medieval mindset, the theological framework, the limited options available. They point out correctly that the medieval period was violent in countless ways, that secular justice was often far harsher, that monasteries were trying to deal with genuine problems within their constraints. This is all true, but it does not erase the horror. It does not make the practice acceptable or understandable in human terms. Men and women suffered and died in those wall cavities in ways that we can barely imagine. Their final hours or days or weeks were filled with darkness and pain and despair. That they were criminals or sinners or believed to be does not make their suffering less real. The question that remains is not whether we approve or disapprove. We disapprove, obviously. The question is what this practice tells us about the institutions we trust, about human nature, about the capacity for cruelty that exists even within organizations founded on principles of love and mercy. Monasteries were supposed to be sanctuaries, places of peace and contemplation, but they were also places of human beings, with all the capacity for fear and anger and cruelty that humans possess. The walls that protected the monks from the outside world also hid what happened within them, and what happened sometimes was very dark indeed. Let us pause here and allow these images to settle, not to dwell on them morbidly, but to acknowledge them, to recognize that this was part of the reality of medieval monastic life. The men who sealed other men into walls were not demons. They were monks following rules, doing what they believed was necessary. The men who died in those cavities were not all innocents. Some had committed serious crimes. Some may have deserved punishment, though not this. The tragedy is not that monsters did monstrous things. The tragedy is that ordinary people, within a system that seemed to them natural and right, inflicted suffering that we can recognize as extraordinary. And yet life went on. After the immurement, the monastery continued. The bells still rang. The prayers were still said. The fields were still tended. The monks passed those walls daily and eventually thought about what lay within them less and less. The horror became normal, accepted, part of the background. This too is instructive. Humans are remarkably adaptable. We can become accustomed to almost anything, can normalize almost any level of cruelty if it is sufficiently routine, if it is framed in the right language, if it is sanctioned by authority. Breathe slowly. Let these thoughts come and go without grasping them. We are separated from that time by centuries. The monasteries where this occurred are mostly ruins now. The men who practiced immurement and those who suffered it are all long dead. Their struggles over, their pain ended. What remains is the historical record, the archaeological evidence, the story. And we tell the story not to disturb your rest, but to understand more completely what the monastery was, in all its complexity and contradiction. In our final segment, we will turn to something different. We will explore the other side of monastic life, the experience not of the victim, but of the privileged, not of those who suffered, but of those who lived in comfort and power. We will see how the same walls that contained such horror also housed luxury that would rival royal courts. But not yet. For now, let the darkness of those cavities fade from your mind. You are safe. You are free. You lie in your own bed, in your own time, where such things are no longer done, where the walls around you contain no secret tombs. Rest in that knowledge. Let your breathing slow. Let your body relax completely. The monastery bells are silent. The stone walls have crumbled. What happened there is history, distant and done. Sleep now if you can, or simply drift, your mind quiet, your body still. We will continue our exploration soon, but for this moment, simply be at peace. We have traveled through the harsh realities of ordinary monastic life, through the corruption of those who twisted sacred office for profit, through the darkest punishment the monastery could inflict. Now, as we near the end of our journey, it is time to understand something that makes all we have discussed even more striking. Not all monks lived the life we described in our first segment. Not all endured the cold and the hunger and the silence in equal measure. Behind the same walls, under the same roof, professing the same vows, there existed a hierarchy so profound that it created essentially different worlds. Imagine two men, both are monks in the same monastery, both wear habits of undyed wool, both have professed vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Both attend the same services in the same chapel. But their experiences of monastic life are as different as a peasant's life is from a king's. The first monk rises at 2 a.m. for matins, his feet striking cold stone. He kneels for an hour in the unheated chapel, returns to his narrow cell for a brief rest, then begins his day of manual labor. He hauls water, tends animals, works in the fields. He eats pottage and bread in silence. He owns nothing, not even the habit he wears. He will live this way until his body breaks down, and he will die on a thin mattress in the infirmary, having known no comfort in his adult life. The second monk wakes in a private chamber when his personal servant gently rouses him at a more reasonable hour. He has slept in a proper bed with linen sheets. His room is heated by a brazier. He attends a private morning prayer service with only other high-ranking monks held in a smaller, warmer chapel. He breaks his fast with white bread, cheese, perhaps an egg, served in his chamber. He spends his day in study, in administrative work, in receiving visitors. His evening meal includes meat, though it is called something else to satisfy the technicalities of the rule. He has books, personal possessions, money at his disposal. He will live comfortably and die peacefully, having wanted for nothing. Both are monks. Both are living monastic life, but they are living different versions of it, versions so divergent that they might as well be in different institutions entirely. This disparity was not accidental. It was built into the system, a reflection of the broader medieval worldview that some people were simply of higher rank by nature, by birth, by divine ordination. The monastery replicated the hierarchies of the secular world it claimed to transcend. Let us explore this parallel reality, this life of privilege and comfort that existed within the same walls that contained so much hardship. Medieval monasteries operated with a rigid class system that divided the community into distinct groups, each with different roles, different living conditions, different futures. At the top were the choir monks, also called the Black Monks in Benedictine houses. These were men who came from noble families, the sons of lords and knights, occasionally wealthy merchants. They entered the monastery with substantial donations, essentially purchasing their positions, though this was never stated so crudely. The donation might be land, rents from properties, a one-time payment of gold. The amounts were significant, often equivalent to 50 or 100 years of a peasant's income. These choir monks were the ones who formed the chapter, who voted on monastery business, who held offices, who could potentially become abbot. They lived in better quarters, received better food, and did intellectual work rather than manual labor. They were monks, but they were elite monks, and their lifestyle reflected that status. Below them were the lay brothers, also called conversi. These came from common families, peasants and artisans who took vows but were not considered full members of the community in the same way. They performed most of the physical labor, the farming and building and cooking that kept the monastery functioning. They attended fewer services, often said simpler prayers. They could not vote in chapter meetings. They could never become abbot. They lived in separate quarters, ate simpler food, and their path within the monastery was forever limited by their origins. At the bottom, barely acknowledged in many records, were the servants. Some monasteries used hired labor from nearby villages. Others had conversi who functioned essentially as servants. These men had taken some form of vows, but were not truly monks in the way the others were. They cleaned, served food, did the most menial tasks. Their living conditions were the worst, their food the plainest, their lives the hardest. This hierarchy was not hidden or considered shameful. It was openly acknowledged as the natural order. The noble brought refinement, education, the ability to manage complex affairs. The commoner brought strong backs and willing hands. Each had their place, and that place was determined by birth, not by merit or devotion or spiritual attainment. Let us follow a young man as he enters monastic life from the upper ranks of society. His name is Robert, and he is the third son of a baron. His oldest brother will inherit the title and lands. His second brother has been promised a position in the royal household. Robert's future has been determined by his family. He will enter the church. This is not presented as a punishment, but as an honor. The church offers a path to power and comfort for younger sons. Robert's family has already negotiated with the abbot of a prestigious Benedictine house. The terms have been settled. The family will donate a manor that generates substantial yearly income. In return, Robert will be accepted as a choir monk, given appropriate quarters, and put on the path toward eventual office within the monastery hierarchy. Robert arrives with an entourage. His family's servants bring his possessions, books, including a beautifully illuminated prayer book that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime, personal furniture, a chair and a desk, fine clothing that will be stored but not discarded, his horse and tack, even a hunting falcon, which technically he should not keep, but which everyone understands will be permitted. He brings his personal servant, a young man who has served his family for years. This servant will be given some minor position within the monastery, allowing him to continue attending Robert. This is irregular but common enough. Noble monks simply expect a certain level of service. Robert is 17 years old. He has been educated by private tutors. He reads Latin fluently, knows French, can compose poetry, plays the lute. He has traveled, has dined at great tables, understands the intricacies of aristocratic life. The monastery is not a retreat from the world he knows, but an extension of it, adapted for religious purpose, but preserving the essential hierarchies and comforts. His initiation into monastic life is formal, but not harsh. He is given time to adjust. His novice period is spent largely in study, learning the details of the rule and the specific customs of this house. But he is not sent to work in the fields. He is not awakened at 2 in the morning for matins, not at first. The assumption is that he will eventually take on important administrative roles, and his education continues to prepare him for that. After a year, he takes his final vows in a ceremony attended by his family. It is a significant social event. His father and brothers come, bringing gifts for the monastery. There is a feast afterward, elaborate and expensive, technically celebrating Robert's commitment to a life of poverty, but actually celebrating his family's continued prominence and influence. And then Robert begins his life as a choir monk, a life that will bear little resemblance to what we described in our first segment. Robert's day begins not at 2 in the morning, but at a more civilized hour. His servant wakes him at dawn, bringing warm water for washing, helping him dress. His cell is not a narrow stone box, but a private chamber. Modest by the standards of his family's manner, but comfortable nonetheless. There is a window with actual glass, a luxury most people never experience. There is a brazier for heat in winter. The furniture, while simple, is well made and sufficient. While the lay brothers are stumbling through darkness to the main chapel for matins, Robert and the other choir monks of high rank attend a private service in a smaller chapel attached to the abbot's quarters. This chapel is heated. The service is shorter. The Latin is pronounced more carefully, with attention to music and ceremony rather than the rushed mechanical recitation that characterizes the main services. After this morning prayer, Robert breaks his fast, not in the common refectory, but in a separate dining hall reserved for choir monks. The difference in the meal is immediately apparent. There is white bread, made from wheat flour, soft and fresh. There is butter, cheese of good quality, sometimes eggs. In winter there might be smoked fish, properly prepared and seasoned. To drink, there is ale of better quality than what is served to the lay brothers, or sometimes wine, watered but present. The meal is eaten in relative quiet, but not absolute silence. Conversation is permitted, though kept to moderate volume. The topics might include monastery business, theological questions, news from the outside world. This is a working meal, a time when the choir monks who actually govern the monastery coordinate their activities. After breakfast, Robert's day is devoted to intellectual work. He might spend time in the scriptorium, not copying basic texts like the lay brothers, but working on illuminated manuscripts, the elaborate decorated pages that showcase the monastery's artistic skill. This work is painstaking and requires talent, but it is done in a comfortable environment with good light, proper tools, and frequent breaks. Or he might work in the library, studying texts in Latin and sometimes Greek, preparing sermons or theological treatises. The library is one of the warmest rooms in the monastery, heated to protect the precious manuscripts. Working here is genuinely pleasant, surrounded by knowledge, comfortable and productive. Or his time might be spent in administration. The monastery owns vast estates, and managing them requires constant attention. Rents must be collected, disputes settled, contracts negotiated. Robert, with his education and his understanding of how the aristocratic world functions, is well suited to this work. He meets with the monastery's stewards, with representatives from the villages on monastery land, with merchants and occasionally with nobles or royal officials. This work requires skill, but also provides variety, contact with the outside world, a sense of purpose and power. The midday meal is the main meal of the day, and again, the choir monks eat separately. The food served here would not be out of place on a minor noble's table. The rule forbids meat from four-footed animals, but this restriction is interpreted creatively. Poultry is served regularly, roasted chicken, duck, goose. These are birds, not four-footed, technically permissible. Fish continues to appear, but prepared with skill and spices, bearing no resemblance to the salty dried herring the lay brothers choked down. Vegetables are fresh in season and carefully stored for winter. Sauces made with butter and herbs accompany many dishes. Pastries appear, sweet tarts that require sugar, that expensive import from the East. The monks eat well, maintaining their health and energy, while the lay brothers grow thin on their endless pottage. Wine is present at the table, though the fiction is maintained that it is for medicinal purposes or for honored guests. In practice, the choir monks drink moderately at every meal, enough to be pleasant, but not enough to be scandalous. Afternoons might bring more study, or they might allow for recreation. The monastery has gardens, and walking in them is considered contemplative exercise. Robert might stroll with other choir monks, discussing philosophy or simply enjoying the weather. In winter, this recreation moves indoors. The warming room, kept heated, becomes a gathering place. Chess sets appear, backgammon boards. These games are technically educational, teaching strategy and patience, and so they are permitted. Some choir monks keep pets, another technical violation that is generally ignored. Small dogs, hunting birds, kept in mews attached to the monastery. Robert still has his falcon, and on appropriate days he takes it out for hunting. This is justified as providing meat for the monastery's table, though the primary purpose is pleasure and the maintenance of aristocratic skills. The afternoon services, sext and nun, are attended but not with the same physical rigor expected of lay brothers. The choir monks might stand rather than kneel, might leave early if pressing business requires it. Their participation is important symbolically, demonstrating continuity of prayer, but their comfort and their work take precedence. Evening brings vespers, the most elaborate service of the day musically. Robert has a good voice, and he enjoys this service, the complex harmonies, the beauty of the chant done well. This is followed by supper, another substantial meal though lighter than midday. Then compline, the final service before sleep, brief and familiar. After compline, Robert returns to his chamber. Unlike the lay brothers, who must observe the great silence, he's permitted to work by candlelight if necessary. He might read, study, write letters. His day ends when he chooses it to end, not when a bell commands him. He sleeps well, in a comfortable bed in a heated room, knowing that tomorrow will bring more of the same comfortable routine. This is monastic life for Robert. It is structured, certainly. It involves prayer and study, but it lacks the harsh privation, the physical punishment, the grinding sameness that defines the experience of the common monks. Robert lives well by any standard of his era, and he does so while professing a vow of poverty. If choir monks like Robert live comfortably, the abbot inhabits a different realm entirely. The position of abbot in a wealthy monastery was one of the most desirable in medieval society. It combined spiritual authority with temporal power, provided enormous resources, and allowed for a lifestyle that rivaled secular nobility. The abbot of a major monastery like Bury St Edmunds, Glastonbury, or Cluny controlled lands that might span hundreds or thousands of acres. The income from these lands was staggering. At Glastonbury in the 15th century, the abbot's revenue exceeded that of many dukes. This wealth was theoretically for the monastery's benefit, but the abbot had nearly complete discretion in its use. The abbot's residence was typically a palace within the monastery complex, separate from the other buildings. It might have 20 or 30 rooms, multiple stories, elaborate decoration. The abbot's private chapel would be beautifully appointed, with carved woodwork, stained glass, gold vessels for mass. His dining hall could host dozens of guests. His private chambers included a bedroom, a study, reception rooms for different classes of visitors. The furnishings reflected this status. Tapestries depicting biblical scenes or classical stories covered the walls. Carpets from the East covered some floors. The abbot's bed was a proper four-poster with curtains heaped with feather mattresses and linen sheets. His desk was made of fine wood, inlaid with ivory. The books in his private library, dozens or even hundreds of volumes, represented a fortune. The abbot dressed in finer versions of the monastic habit made from better wool, sometimes lined with fur for winter. He wore rings, symbols of his office, sometimes containing precious stones. His staff of office might be decorated with silver. He lived surrounded by beauty and comfort, justified as appropriate to his dignity and necessary for receiving important visitors. And visitors there were constantly. The abbot was a political figure. He met with bishops, with representatives of the crown, with nobles. He hosted feasts, elaborate affairs with multiple courses, entertainment, fine wines. These events were understood as necessary for maintaining the monastery's influence and protecting its interests. But they were also displays of wealth and power, assertions of status. The abbot traveled frequently, always with an entourage. 30 or 40 people might accompany him on a journey to London or to visit other monasteries. There were servants, guards, other choir monks serving as assistants, and secretaries. The procession would include pack horses carrying the abbot's belongings, his vestments for saying Mass, gifts for his hosts, supplies for the journey. The expense was enormous, but it was considered appropriate to the abbot's dignity. When staying in other places, the abbot expected accommodations suitable to his rank. He would not sleep in common rooms, but would be given private chambers, often displacing the host's family members. Meals served to the abbot had to match his standards, a significant burden for smaller houses or poorer hosts. Some abbots rarely attended the regular monastic services. They had their own schedule, their own chapel, their own priorities. They might appear for the most important feast days, for ceremonies where their presence was symbolically necessary. But the daily round of prayers that defined monastic life for the ordinary monks was, for the abbot, optional. The position was elected theoretically. The choir monks voted, but in practice, the outcome was often determined in advance through political maneuvering. Wealthy families placed their sons in monasteries with the explicit goal of having them eventually elected abbot. The position became hereditary in all but name, passed among members of interconnected noble families. And once elected, an abbot held the position for life. There was no accountability except to the bishop, and bishops could often be influenced through the same networks of family and wealth. An incompetent or corrupt abbot might be tolerated for decades because removing him was more trouble than allowing him to continue. Archaeological excavations of monastery sites have revealed details about elite monastic life that the written records often omit or minimize. These physical remains tell stories of comfort and luxury that contradict the image of austere devotion. In the quarters that housed choir monks, excavators have found remains of hypocaust systems, the Roman heating technology that used hot air circulating through channels under floors. This technology was expensive to install and operate, requiring constant fuel. That it was present in monastic buildings indicates how much value was placed on comfort for the elite. Private bathhouses have been discovered, complete with heated water and drainage systems. Bathing was generally discouraged in monasteries as a potential luxury and source of temptation. But for the elite, private bathing facilities were apparently acceptable. The difference between public bathhouses, forbidden, and private ones, permitted, reveals how rules were bent to accommodate the desires of those in power. Latrines in the choir monks' quarters were sophisticated, with proper seats and sometimes even primitive forms of plumbing. Meanwhile, the lay brothers used simple holes over pits, the medieval equivalent of outhouses. The physical comfort of one's most private moments varied dramatically depending on status. Artifacts recovered from elite quarters include gaming pieces, elaborately carved chess sets, dice made from bone or ivory. Musical instruments appear: lutes, psalteries, small harps. These items indicate leisure time spent in ways that seem inconsistent with the supposedly rigorous discipline of monastic life. Fragments of elaborate pottery and glassware show that meals were served on quality tableware, not wooden trenchers. Wine bottles from Italian and French vineyards appear in the archaeological record, their origin identifiable from the distinctive clay. Spices from the East, expensive and rare, left traces in containers found in the ruins of monastic kitchens that served the elite. Perhaps most tellingly, excavations have found coins and even small hoards of precious metals in areas associated with choir monks. The vow of poverty supposedly meant monks could own nothing personally, but clearly some monks had access to money, kept it, used it for purposes that left no record but required ready cash. The quality of the manuscripts produced tells its own story. Some monasteries created books of extraordinary beauty, illuminated with gold leaf, bound in leather decorated with precious stones. These were not practical books, but art objects, demonstrations of wealth and skill. That monasteries devoted resources to such productions, while their lay brothers wore threadbare habits and ate insufficient food, reveals the priorities clearly. How did the monastery reconcile this disparity with its stated principles? How did monks living in luxury square their lifestyle with a vow of poverty? The justifications were numerous, and within the medieval worldview, coherent, if not convincing to modern ears. First, the argument of dignity. The abbot, representing the monastery, had to maintain a certain standard to command respect from secular powers. If the abbot appeared poor and humble, kings and nobles might not take him seriously, might not protect the monastery's interests. The luxury was not for personal enjoyment, but for the institution's benefit. Second, the concept of the different types of poverty. There was individual poverty, owning nothing personally, which all monks maintained, at least in theory. But there was also communal wealth, which was permissible and even necessary. The monastery owned the lands, the treasures, the beautiful objects. Individual monks merely used them. This distinction allowed for extraordinary wealth as long as it was technically communal. Third, the theology of hierarchy. God had created different orders of being, from angels to kings to nobles to commoners. Each had their appropriate station. To treat a noble monk the same as a peasant monk was to violate natural law, to disrupt divine order. The choir monk's better living conditions reflected his higher nature, his greater capacity for spiritual and intellectual work. Fourth, the practical argument of specialized labor. Choir monks did important work that required them to be healthy, alert, capable of sustained mental effort. The lay brothers' work was physical and could be done even in a state of relative exhaustion and malnutrition. Therefore, better food and comfort for the choir monks was an investment in the monastery's mission, not self-indulgence. Fifth, the tradition of the rule itself. Saint Benedict, whose rule governed most Western monasteries, came from a noble family. His rule, while emphasizing simplicity, never intended absolute equality. The abbot was to be shown special respect. Guests of high rank were to be honored appropriately. The rule allowed for flexibility based on circumstances. These justifications were repeated, taught, internalized. Monks who benefited from the system believed, or convinced themselves they believed, that their comfort was justified, appropriate, even necessary. And those who did not benefit, the lay brothers, laboring in the fields and sleeping on thin mattresses, were taught to accept their station as divinely ordained, to find spiritual merit in their suffering while their betters lived well. Not everyone accepted this system without question. Throughout the medieval period, reform movements arose within the church, calling for return to authentic poverty and simplicity. The Cistercians, founded in the late 11th century, attempted to restore rigorous observance of the rule. They built their monasteries in remote locations, deliberately choosing hardship. They refused the elaborate wealth of the Benedictines, wore undyed wool, ate simple food, and worked their own lands rather than relying on peasant labor. But even the Cistercian reform eventually succumbed to the same patterns. Within a few generations, Cistercian monasteries accumulated wealth. The most successful became as rich as the Benedictine houses they had originally opposed. Hierarchies re-emerged. Comfort crept back in. The same justifications that had excused Benedictine luxury were applied to Cistercian circumstances. The Franciscans in the 13th century represented another radical attempt at reform. Francis of Assisi explicitly rejected all property, even communal property. Franciscans were to be truly poor, owning nothing, begging for their daily bread, sleeping in whatever shelter they could find. For a brief time, they maintained this ideal. But the Franciscan order grew rapidly, became influential, and faced the same pressures. How could an order with thousands of members with missions across Europe function without resources? How could they run schools, care for the sick, maintain their churches without money? Within Francis's own lifetime, compromises began. After his death, the order split between those who insisted on absolute poverty and those who accepted the necessity of property for effective ministry. Eventually, the moderates won. The Franciscans built great churches, acquired books and property, and while they maintained simplicity in theory, in practice, they became another wealthy order. The pattern repeated with every reform movement. Begin with radical commitment to poverty and simplicity. Grow successful, accumulate resources, begin making exceptions. Eventually reproduce the very hierarchies and comforts that the reform had opposed. The system, it seemed, was stronger than any individual's commitment to change it. Let us return to our two monks, the ones we imagined at the beginning of this segment. They live in the same physical space, profess the same vows, serve the same God. But their daily experiences are so different that they might as well inhabit different worlds. The lay brother wakes in cold darkness, eats pottage, works until his body aches, prays on hard stone, and sleeps on a thin mattress. He will never rise higher than his current station. He will die having experienced no comfort, no leisure, no ease. His entire adult life will be defined by discomfort and labor, punctuated by prayer. The choir monk wakes in comfort, eats well, spends his day in intellectual work and administration, and sleeps in a proper bed. He might become abbot, might wield real power, might travel and meet important people. His life, while structured by monastic routine, contains pleasure, variety, and satisfaction. He will die peacefully, having lived better than most people of his era. They pass each other in the cloister. They attend the same services, though they stand in different sections of the chapel. They are both monks, but the word means entirely different things for each of them. The lay brother, if he is honest with himself, must feel resentment. How can he not? He sees the choir monks eating better food, wearing warmer clothing, living in comfort. He hears them justify it with theology and tradition, and perhaps part of him believes those justifications. But another part must rebel, must feel the injustice of it. The choir monk, if he is honest with himself, must feel some guilt. He knows the disparity. He sees the lay brothers laboring while he studies in the heated library. But he has been raised to believe in hierarchy, in natural order, in the propriety of his position. And the human capacity for rationalization is strong. He convinces himself that his comfort is appropriate, that he deserves it, that the system is just. And so they coexist, these two versions of monastic life, each reinforcing the other. The lay brother's poverty makes the choir monk's comfort seem acceptable by contrast, not true luxury, but merely adequate provision. The choir monk's learning and administrative skill make the lay brother's labor seem appropriate, each doing what he is fitted for. The system sustains itself through this mutual dependence and mutual blindness, through the acceptance of inequality as natural law rather than human choice. This system endured for centuries, but it could not last forever. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century attacked the corruption and hypocrisy of the medieval church, and the monasteries were prime targets. Luther and Calvin pointed to the disparity between monastic ideals and monastic reality, between vows of poverty and lives of comfort. The criticism resonated because it was fundamentally true. In England, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, seizing their wealth for the crown. The inventory of what was found is staggering: gold plate, jeweled reliquaries, fine vestments, libraries of priceless manuscripts, cellars of wine, treasuries full of coin. The monasteries that had claimed to be poor possessed wealth beyond imagination. The monks were pensioned off, the choir monks receiving comfortable yearly payments that allowed them to live well as private citizens. The lay brothers received much less or nothing at all, sent back to villages that no longer had place for them. Even in dissolution, the hierarchy persisted. Across Protestant Europe, similar dissolutions occurred. The monastery system, which had seemed permanent and divinely ordained, collapsed within a generation. The buildings were torn down or converted to secular use. The lands were sold to nobles and merchants. The elaborate structures of monastic life simply ceased to exist. In Catholic countries, monasteries survived but were increasingly reformed. The most egregious displays of wealth were curtailed. The hierarchy remained, but the obvious hypocrisy was reduced. The Council of Trent in the mid-16th century addressed some of these issues, attempting to restore genuine discipline and reduce the gap between ideal and practice. But the fundamental revelation remained. The medieval monastery, examined closely, was not the sanctuary of holiness and poverty it claimed to be. It was a microcosm of medieval society, replicating all its hierarchies, its injustices, its inequalities. The monks who claimed to have renounced the world had merely reconstructed the world within their walls, baptizing secular distinctions with theological language. Let your mind rest now on this final image of the monastery, not as it appeared from outside, with its high walls and its sacred purpose, not as it wanted to be seen, as a place of devotion and sacrifice, but as it truly was. A complex human institution, full of contradictions and compromises, where some suffered deeply and others lived comfortably, where the same vows meant entirely different things depending on who spoke them. The monastery has passed into history now. The buildings remain in places converted to museums or hotels or simply ruins marking the landscape, but the world that created them, that sustained them, that finally dissolved them, is gone. The hierarchies that seemed eternal and natural have been swept away. The theological justifications that made inequality seem divinely ordained no longer convince. What remains is the story and perhaps the lesson that institutions claiming transcendence are still human institutions, that people professing poverty can live in luxury if the definitions are flexible enough, that the same organization can contain both genuine devotion and cynical exploitation, both authentic suffering and comfortable privilege. Breathe slowly. Let these reflections settle without disturbing your peace. We are not here to condemn or to judge, only to understand more fully what was. The monks, elite and common, lived within the system they inherited, making choices that seemed right to them, justifying what needed justification, believing what they needed to believe. And now we come to the end of our long journey through the medieval monastery. We have seen its harshness and its beauty, its cruelty and its devotion, its fraud and its faith. We have walked its cold corridors and sat at its separated tables. We have understood, perhaps, how complex institutions are, how they contain multitudes, how simple narratives fail to capture their reality. Rest now. The monastery bells have stopped ringing. The walls have come down. The monks, all of them, have long since returned to the earth that received them without regard for their rank or their vows or their suffering. What we carry forward is simply the knowledge of what was, the understanding of what humans create when they build institutions, the awareness that things are rarely as simple as they seem. And so we have traveled far together through these medieval halls. We have experienced the harsh discipline of ordinary monastic life, the gnawing hunger and bitter cold, the silence that pressed against the mind like a physical weight. We have followed the corrupt abbot who sold sacred relics for personal profit, who lived in luxury while professing poverty. We have stood before the sealed walls that contained the immured, those who died in darkness for crimes real or imagined. And we have seen the parallel world of the monastic elite, the comfort and power hidden behind the same walls that contained such suffering. The monastery was all these things at once. It was not simply good or evil, holy or corrupt, sanctuary or prison. It was human, in all the complexity that word implies. Men entered those walls seeking God, seeking security, seeking power, or having no choice at all. What they found depended largely on the circumstances of their birth and the characters of those who held authority over them. As you lie here now, in your own time, in your own space, perhaps you can appreciate more deeply the small freedoms you possess. The warmth that surrounds you, taken for granted, would have seemed miraculous luxury to most medieval monks. The food available to you, varied and abundant, would have been unimaginable. The freedom to speak when you wish, to move when you choose, to shape your own life within broad limits. These are not small things. They are extraordinary privileges, won slowly over centuries of change. The monastery taught us that institutions claiming holiness are still made of humans with all their weaknesses, that suffering is not always ennobling, that comfort does not necessarily corrupt, that systems of power replicate themselves even in the most unlikely places, that what people profess and what they practice can diverge dramatically. That history is rarely as simple as we would like it to be. But perhaps the monastery also showed us something else, that people endure, that even in the harshest circumstances, humans find ways to survive, to maintain their humanity, to create meaning. The monks who rose at 2 in the morning for decades, who knelt on cold stone until their knees were destroyed, who ate pottage and wore thin wool and owned nothing, they persisted. Their lives were hard beyond our comfortable imagining, but they lived those lives day after day, year after year. There is something remarkable in that endurance, even if we would never choose it for ourselves. And in the contradictions of the monastery, in its mingling of the sacred and the profane, the genuine and the fraudulent, perhaps we see something universally human. All our institutions contain these contradictions. All our attempts to create perfect systems founder on human nature. This does not mean we should not try, but it means we should not be surprised when our efforts fall short, when hypocrisy appears, when the ideal and the real diverge. The medieval period is often called the Dark Ages, though historians now prefer other terms. But perhaps there is a different kind of darkness we have explored tonight. Not the darkness of ignorance, but the darkness of human complexity, of institutions that contain both light and shadow, of lives that mix suffering and comfort, cruelty and kindness, devotion and cynicism in measures that defy simple judgment. Let your mind release these heavy thoughts now. Let them drift away like morning mist. The monastery stands in the past, its walls crumbling, its inhabitants long departed. Their struggles are over. Their suffering has ended. Their stories remain only as lessons, as windows into a time very different from our own, as reminders of how far we have traveled and how much further we might yet go. Your breathing has slowed, perhaps without you noticing. Your body has grown heavy, comfortable, ready for rest. The journey through medieval stone and medieval mines has been long, but it ends here, now, in this moment of peace. As you drift towards sleep, or simply rest in quiet wakefulness, let yourself feel gratitude for the ordinary comforts that surround you, the bed that supports you, the warmth that requires no suffering to obtain, The silence that is choice rather than compulsion. The freedom to wake when your body is ready rather than when a bell commands it. The monks would not recognize your world. The technology, the comfort, the freedoms would seem miraculous to them, but perhaps they would recognize in you the same human desires they felt, for warmth, for rest, for peace, for meaning, for connection. Across the centuries, across the vast differences in how we live, these basic needs remain constant. Sleep now, if sleep will come, or simply rest, letting your mind be quiet, your body be still. There are no bells to wake you at 2 in the morning, no stone floors wait to freeze your feet, no pottage and stale bread define your morning. You are free, comfortable, safe. The monastery has released its secrets, the walls have fallen, the silence is your own to fill or to maintain as you choose. The darkness that surrounds you holds no horrors, no immured bodies, no desperate scratching. It is simply the peaceful dark of night in your own time, your own place. Let it all go now. The medieval world, with all its harshness and contradiction. The monks living and suffering and occasionally thriving. The buildings slowly returning to the earth. The stories, preserved now in your memory but requiring nothing more from you. Rest. Be at peace. The dark truth about medieval monasteries you've never been told.